Thank you, David. And David's right. You come to the Camden Conference and you never know who you're going to meet. I was in the lobby of the very nice Camden Harbor Inn, and suddenly I meet somebody and he introduces himself and he says, "I'm David." I said, "That's nice, I'm Tanvi." And suddenly he says, "I'm David Brancaccio." And I had this, oh my God, fangirl moment, because usually I hear him on my radio in the morning. I am delighted to be here with all of you. It was a real pleasure to be invited. I was one of those people who got persuasive emails from Charlotte Singleton, and it was lovely to meet her. I appreciate the chance to meet her daughter, Abigail, a couple of evenings ago. And she was very persuasive about how great the conference was. Also persuasive was my colleague, Constanza Stalzenmuller, who I believe was here a couple of years ago. And she told me how engaging all of you were, or whoever was there at the time. And the last couple of days has shown us that that is indeed true. So I'm delighted to be here. And I'm also just want to thank the Camden Conference team, as others have. Bruce has been really helpful in kind of getting us here, making sure that this conference is so great, but also Kimberly and Peter and others as well. I want to start by taking us to 2013 and to northern India. Because I am going to talk to you about India's global aspirations, but I also want to talk to you about how those aspirations are connected to India's domestic aspirations. That those two things, and this is something Professor Dallas ended at, about why India's kind of global objectives are connected to its domestic ones, and I want to pick up from that point. And I want to tell you a story starting, as I said, in 2013. Up in northern India, very near the India-China border, you had been an inaccessible place where it was hard for the Indian military to get troops out there. And in 2013, an Indian Air Force pilot lands a C-130 jet on this advanced landing ground that had been built. It was the first time that that particular aircraft, built by an American company, had actually ever landed at that height. This is about 17,000 feet, 5,000 meters. And he lands this plane. India had just only a few years before that started acquiring American military equipment again. There had been decades in which India mostly depended on Soviet military equipment, some French, some British equipment, but largely Soviet. This is the first time that this American military transport aircraft, owned by the Indian Air Force, lands at this ground. Now I want to take you from northern India to just a few weeks ago to southern India, to a city called Hyderabad, where I met on a factory floor a young woman in her 20s. Now I'm usually, and even you've seen many kind of people who've come across, I'm usually considered in my 40s one of the younger people who works in international relations, in think tanks, etc. There's nothing that makes you feel old in your 40s like going to India. Lots of young people, everywhere. And this young woman, half my age, from a rural area in Telangana, which is the state that Hyderabad is part of. She'd never been to the big city a few years before that, hadn't spoken a word of English, but she's on the factory floor. What does this factory do? It produces every one of the C-130s now built in the world. It produces the tails on every one of those. And she's on the shop floor, as are a number of other young Indian men and women. That tells you both in terms of how, for that young woman, it is not just that the C-130 is enhancing India's capability to defend its borders, or, as was recently the case, evacuate a number of its citizens from Sudan. But it also, that C-130 that is now being produced in a joint venture between an American and Indian company, or the tail is being produced, it has changed the life of this young Indian woman, who now has been trained, and somebody at the company was telling me, we don't know if we can retain people because they get so well trained, they speak English now, that all our subcontractors are hiring them away from us. So just to tell you the story that while we're talking about these abstracts, as many of the speakers have said, this is about people at the end of the day. And India's global aspirations for Indian policymakers since the beginning, as Professor Dallas said, have always been connected to kind of those facets on the ground. So what are kind of India's broader objectives. Security and prosperity, others have talked about it. I'm not going to kind of belabor the point. It's also self-evident. So those, you see whether it's for India kind of securing itself internally or from its rivals, China and Pakistan, or as Professor Tellis also said, in achieving its goals of economic growth and development and technological transformation, or for India needing to make the world safe for India's rise. All these kind of objectives are part of India's global aspirations and objectives. The security and prosperity goals, as I said, are self-evident. Let me say a little bit more about the rightful place on the world stage and strategic autonomy objectives. These aren't goals that are restricted to one party, one political party, that is. You'll hear this from different political parties, from people across the spectrum, though they might come at it from very different perspectives. The rightful place on the world stage. Why is that? To some extent, you've heard from others, there's a historical dimension. The previous Indian National Security Advisor, when somebody asked him about India being an emerging power, he said India is not an emerging power, it is a re-emerging power. There's also a status dimension. And as others have pointed out, and Ambassador Rao mentioned, there's a representation dimension to this. But this is also, this rightful place on the world stage is also about India seeking a greater voice and ability to shape the regional and global environment in which it is trying to achieve its national objectives. So you hear India talk about itself as aspiring to be a leading power. It also talks about itself as aspiring to be a bridging power between North and South, between East and West. And to some extent, this is partly because India doesn't want to just seek to be a bridging power for its broader objectives, from Prime Minister Nehru to Prime Minister Modi. Indian prime ministers have known that peace in the region and world, peace and stability, are crucial to India's growth and development. And so even when India did not have the capability to do so, it has always cared about conflicts in other parts of the world, and particularly in Asia. So India's talked about being a bridging power. It aspires to be a leading power. But more than anything, India seeks to be an independent pole or independent power. And so when it's acquiring capabilities, it is for growth and development, it is for security, but it is also for that objective of achieving independence. And that comes to the point about strategic autonomy. You'll notice I put that as an objective, because I don't believe India sees strategic autonomy or self-reliance, as you sometimes hear it, as just a means to an end, as others might. It sees it as an end in itself. What does strategic autonomy mean? It gets thrown around, means different things to different countries. The French have a definition of it. What does it mean for India? It means independence of action. Indians don't want their choices being made in other capitals, the way London made choices for India before 1947, including taking India into the world wars without asking anybody in India itself, other than the viceroy. You also see kind of India, what this means, strategic autonomy, is India sees strategic autonomy as being achieved through the acquisition of capabilities. That's how you become more autonomous. But at the end of the day, India has also realized that to get those capabilities, to eventually become more autonomous, it needs partnerships, which I'll come back to, that can help build those capabilities. We talk a lot about what strategic autonomy means. Let me just point out what strategic autonomy doesn't mean for India, because sometimes it is seen as that. It does not mean that, it means, yes, India will have multiple partnerships with multiple countries, but it does not mean those relationships are equidistant. This is not a hub and spoke. You'll also hear the term self-reliance, as you mentioned. But strategic autonomy for India does not mean self-sufficiency, and it does not mean isolation. Why? Because at the end of the day, international engagement is not a choice, but a necessity for India. It needs kind of the world for a whole lot of these things on this list. But it also can't escape its history and the legacy, partnerships, and other interests that that brings with it. India also cannot escape geography. And You saw this map yesterday that Professor Tellis had a version of. India cannot escape the region it resides in. The Indo-Pacific, therefore, will be crucial to India achieving all of its objectives: security, prosperity, strategic autonomy, and rightful place on the world stage. As Professor Tellis said, there's the hope aspect of it, that all these partnerships in that immediate and extended neighborhood in this area, that these countries, India will have engagement with them. They provide India resources, connectivities, options. But there's a fear aspect to India's engagement and interest in these regions as well, which is that this region, it can either facilitate if things go well, but it can be the most disruptive of India's objectives if things don't work out as India wants. And so you see an India that is engaging, and nowhere is this more evident about the disruptive potential of the neighborhood or how it can work well for India than in India's immediate neighborhood. This region can either be a springboard for India, or it can be the kind of Lilliputians to India's Gulliver, keeping India tied down, making sure that India cannot be more than a South Asian power at the end of the day. This is also why India engages with its extended neighborhood, which increasingly is an area where India has been deepening, as Ashley pointed out yesterday, defense and economic ties with countries in Southeast Asia and in West Asia, or the Middle East, as India calls it. This is why you are seeing India deploying a range of vessels and aircraft right now to counter Houthi attacks or pirate attacks to its west. Because this region matters for India, it matters for India's economy and security. Now, there's a country that is actually both a part of India's immediate and extended neighborhood, and that is China. It is crucial for good and bad to India's objective. Now, till about 15, 20 years ago, India saw China as facilitating its objectives. That if India had a stable border with China, it could do more. So if it had a stable security, it could do more economically in terms of having that peace and development. That is why you saw an effort. After decades, India and China fought a war in 1962, and there were 2.5 decades where they had restored ties, but ties were pretty minimal. But you saw an effort between 1988 and 2013, across different governments, between India and China to sign a range of agreements to manage their boundary dispute. India's incentive was that it could then allow India to focus partly at home. It didn't have to worry as much about China being a challenger. But it also, more positively, allowed economic ties. As China was growing, you heard in India that India could benefit. Economic ties would be an opportunity for India and China. You also saw India and China cooperating in the multilateral sphere. India, along with Russia and China, developed something called the Russia-India-China trilateral in the early 2000s. Then you saw the formation of the BRICS. It was initially BRIC with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa joined in the 2000s. And the idea had been is that actually that rightful place on the world stage, the West really wasn't giving it to these countries. And so they said, let's form this these non-West groupings or platforms. But if that was then, 15, 20 years ago, look at now. Today, the situation is different. There's more concern about how China can disrupt, not facilitate, India's objectives. And what changed? I'm not going to talk about it too much here. I'll just mention it briefly in a shameless plug, not for me, but for the guests who have appeared on this podcast I host, Global India. One of the things they talk about is what changed in great depth it's a whole season on India and China. I would recommend you go listen to them, not to me, and explains the shift over time. Briefly what happened, and Ambassador Rao mentioned this, there was a boundary clash in 2020. And this was an inflection point. It wasn't like India hadn't experienced Chinese assertiveness before, but there was a sense that there was a bit of a turn in how China was behaving in the region and towards India in the 2007 to 2009 period. But there's a real change when Xi Jinping comes to power. The boundary had been stable for about 2.5 decades at that point between India and China. But since Xi comes to power, there's again and again frequent crises at the border. 2013, 2014, smaller one in 2015, 2017 at the Bhutan-China-India tri-junction. In each case, India accuses the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, of trying to unilaterally change the status quo. But the boundary crisis in 2020 was different for the reasons Ambassador Rao said. First fatal clash in 45 years between the two countries. More fundamentally, there was a sense in India that those boundary agreements that the two countries had signed, that they had, as one person, a former ambassador to China and a former foreign secretary, Vijay Gokhale, put it, the agreements lie in a dustbin of history. Now, others will say it's not that bad, but nonetheless, most would agree that this is the lowest point in India's relationship with China since the two countries fought a war in 1962. Now, is it just about the boundary? No, there's a whole range of differences that India and China have. They're not confined to it. There's a series of bilateral differences. There's also a series of regional differences that are increasingly about what the region looks like. One complication that India and China have is China's neighborhood is India's neighborhood. India's neighborhood is China's neighborhood. They have overlapping peripheries. And so India is increasingly concerned about China's not just economic ties in its neighborhood, but the strategic and political influence that China now has and is seeking to deploy in those countries and shape their choices, vis-a-vis India as well, sometimes vis-a-vis the US too. India is also concerned that traditionally an area where it didn't really see China or Chinese presence is growing in the Indian Ocean region, to India's south. So not just to its west because of China-Pakistan relations, not because towards its kind of other peripheries in terms of other South Asian neighbors, but also now in its south, to in terms of the Indian Ocean region. China, in turn, is concerned about India's deepening ties with its neighbors, but also with its rivals, like the US, like Japan, and increasingly, because it seems to see Australia as a rival to Australia. But when I said it's about what the region looks like, you will hear governments in India say, we don't just want a multipolar world, we want a multipolar Asia. And there's a sense that China wants a unipolar Asia dominated by Beijing, where Beijing sets the terms. There's also this broader sense that globally, China is out to hinder India's rise. And overall, there's also a lack of trust in the relationship that goes across these different differences. There's another overall problem, which I again won't belabor because it is the same chart you saw from Professor Tellis, which is this capabilities gap. So India has all these differences and challenges from China, but it also has a capabilities gap that has grown. Now, these graphs also tell you this gap between India and China has had implications for how India thinks about its partners. How do you deal with a gap like this when you have a challenger? You deal with it by building your own capabilities, which India is doing, but that takes time. And so India needs partners. What does it do? Non-alignment, no longer an option. Even Nehru said there is no non-alignment when it comes to China. Alliance is not an option for the reasons that we've talked about. India thinks it would take away from its autonomy, its independence of action. But let's be clear. We often talk about why won't India be a US ally? Is an alliance on offer? Is the US ready to take on India's security and give it a commitment? So an alliance is not really an offer either. A deeper security partnership, yes, but not an alliance. So what has been the answer? It's been alignment with countries, other countries that can help with what Professor Tellis talked about, external balancings, shaping a favorable balance of power in the region, deterring China, but also those partners being important, especially the US, in terms of helping build India's capabilities. And this, both India's kind of perception of China, as well as its desire and its need for partnerships that have shared view and concerns about China and a shared vision of the Indo-Pacific, is why is also shaping how India sees US-China competition. So many people, if you ask them, what do you think India's view on US-China competition will be, they think about the Cold War and say India was non-aligned between the US and Soviet Union, that's what India will do. And so this is the perception of how India will deal with US-China competition. But in reality, for the reasons I said, this is really more of the reality. It has very different relationships with China and the US. And indeed, India sees the US as part of the solution to its China problem. Why is the US important to India? It's not just as a solution to the China problem. I will come to that. But it more broadly for Indian governments from different parties, different prime ministers, for them, fundamentally, it is about the US being important because it helps India achieve its objectives more broadly, particularly in India's economic and technological transformation. But also, yes, in the Indo-Pacific, India and the US have shared, though not identical, objectives and shared concerns about China's assertive behavior. And here the US is crucial for India in building its capabilities, in providing alternatives in the region, including in South Asia, and in maintaining a favorable balance of power, as I mentioned. And this kind of convergence has led to a range of domains where the two countries are now cooperating. And this has meant shedding some shibboleths, some hesitations that both countries had, including in India in terms of deepening defense and security ties. Today, you have an initiative for critical and emerging technologies between the two countries. We talked about space at the beginning. The US is going to help with India's human spaceflight program, something the Russians traditionally did. India and the US are sending a joint satellite up in space shortly as well. Also, the US, you remember that young woman I talked about on the assembly line? That's only one joint venture. Now American companies are thinking about India as part of their de-risking efforts. Again, there's a China element, but it's not just about China. It's about India as well. So you're seeing kind of some of this change over time. It's leading to cooperation. But you are also seeing, because of the growing utility and importance of the US for India, India has shifted some of its views in terms of what it's willing to do, not just defense and security cooperation. The example I often give is the shift in India's view of US power and presence in the Indian Ocean region. India had a bit of a Monroe Doctrine, still does to some extent. This is India's neighborhood, other external actors should stay out. Well, now that China is in India's neighborhood in a much more significant degree, India is actually working with the US in the Indian Ocean region. Now India wants to see more US there, not less US. And so you're seeing India and the US, for example, having consultations on South Asia. They don't always agree, but nonetheless having consultations. They're also working in other regions, and there's about to be an India-US consultation starting on the Indian Ocean, as well as on working together in Africa. You're also seeing India join things like the US Mineral Security Partnership. You're seeing India and the US work together in different parts of South Asia in very specific ways. The US Development Finance Corporation is helping finance a port being developed in Sri Lanka by an Indian company. Why? Because the other choice is for China to build that port. You're also seeing India not just work together with the US, and this is a bit of an experiment for India as well. Work with the US not just bilaterally or in the region or in international institutions, but you're seeing India and the US now working together in like-minded coalitions, issue-based or interest-based coalitions, minilaterals, plurilaterals, India calls them plurilaterals. Think of them as like-minded coalitions. The first ones that India indeed had, some of the first ones India had, were with the US India, Japan trilateral, and the quadrilateral that you've heard with Australia, India, Japan, and the US. And if you think this is just a Modi phenomena, both the ones I just mentioned were started in the previous government. Newer ones include India and the US working with the UAE and Israel in something called the U2 minilateral. Obviously, a Star Wars fan named that. I don't particularly like it. I thought it should be called the West Asia Quad or something like that, whack. But they went with I2U2. Now, it's not like, as I wrap up, it's not like there are not divergences between the US and India. They differ sometimes about each other's partnerships. India ain't a fan of a US relationship with Pakistan at various points, still, to this day, even though it's a different kind. And even though India-Russia relations aren't what they used to be, the US, as we've heard, is not a fan of India-Russia relations. There are other differences that have changed somewhat over time and are actually now areas where India and the US are cooperating, trade, climate change. And many of these differences are being managed, but nonetheless they exist. More broadly, because the two countries are very different, even though many of the similarities are often drawn out, at the end of the day, more broadly, how these countries see things are who they are. And so it's some of the differences that come up between the US and India are because one country is the one that experienced decolonization in the 20th century, and the other is the one that experienced decolonization in the 18th century. One is a developed country, one is a developing country. One is a country that does alliances, the other one is one that basically has a taboo against alliances. But nonetheless, you're seeing these countries align to do a variety of things. Having said that, along with the divergences, you also see a desire in India because of concerns about how aligned it's getting with the US, and a desire not to either A, become too dependent on the US, or because of uncertainty, not just Trump-related uncertainties, but uncertainty about the US that exists. So how do you lessen, if you're India, how do you lessen that dependence? And I am wrapping up, I promise. These next couple of slides are going to go very quickly. How do you do this? You develop multiple options. Now, this is not exactly representative, but it gives you an idea of India's strategy is diversification. You can call it other things, it's basically diversification. It has a diversified portfolio of partners. If you look, it's not just the US, the Europeans have a big weight as well, Australia, Japan. But this is a portfolio that has perhaps a bit too much weight of the West for India's comfort, so what has India been doing? India doesn't have the option of growing the China option, and it doesn't really have the option even in terms of it'll maintain the Russia option, but it's not going to deepen that further because Russia in some ways is not very relevant to some of India's economic imperatives. Also, it's getting closer to India's rival, China. And so what do you do in that case? You increase the denominator. You deal with the global south, with Brazil, with South Africa, with a number of African countries. You deepen your engagement with Southeast Asia to your east. You deepen your engagement with countries in the Middle East. You increase the denominator. Suddenly you have a more diversified portfolio of partners. These countries across the globe will help India achieve its objectives. But the fate of those aspirations doesn't just, or even primarily depend on these partners or even developments in India's external environment. It depends on what happens within India, politically, economically, socially, in the security sense as well. Imperatives at home, as I mentioned at the start, are shaping India's interactions abroad. But what India can do abroad, how attractive it is to partners, will in turn depend on the choices that India makes at home. Thank you.